love you guys so much, man. That's awesome. You guys are awesome. Hey, if we haven't met before, my name is Kevin. I'm the high school minister here at Northside. Pumped to be with you today because today I believe we are talking about one of the most important things in your life, and it's actually a question. It's a question that we don't really ask, but yet it directs what we do. It directs like how we interact with other people. It directs how we feel about ourselves. And it's a little question. It's actually 3 words. It's not super complicated to ask, but it's really hard to answer. And here's what it is. Who am I? Say it with me. Who am I? Who am I? I've seen kids, junior high kids, high school kids, adults wrestle with this question. Who am I? What makes me me? And oftentimes we search for the answer to this question in the people around us. You know, when I was in middle school, specifically like 7th and 8th grade, those were some of the toughest like relational and emotional years of my life. Does anybody resonate with that? Anybody feel that way about middle school when you think back to it? Just like blocked it out because you don't want to deal with it anymore? Yeah? Okay, it took my adult years and probably a lot of like self-reflection to deal with the emotional scars of middle school. But here's what happened. I had a friend named John, and John was my elementary school best friend. We would do everything together. He lived in the neighborhood next to mine, and so I'd ride my bike over to his house. He'd ride his bike over to my house. We would like have sleepovers on like Friday night, Saturday night, and we would play video games till like 1 or 2 in the morning at 5th grade, right? Can I get an amen to that from anybody? Yes, okay, got it. So that's what we would do, and we loved hanging out together. We loved spending time together. He was my best friend. Like, we did everything together. Well, then we went into 6th grade, and all the elementary schools in Wichita, Kansas dumped into this one school for 6th grade, and so all of a sudden we're around different people, and John started becoming best friends with somebody else. Mm-hmm. You know what this is like, right? You guys are picking up like the vibe I'm putting off right now, aren't you? And so what happened, John and Zach became best friends, and Kevin had nobody, right? And so I was like the kid eating lunch by myself, right? You know? And I was the kid that like, whenever John and Zach would do something, you know, I wouldn't get invited all of a sudden. I was like, John, I thought we were like this, but you're kind of a jerk right now. You know, that was what was going through my head. And so eventually, here's what happened. This is what I found interesting. Okay, so Zach was, I'm sure he was probably a nice guy, but I viewed him through the lens of stealing my best friend, so probably didn't understand him correctly. But Zach was the guy who's really good at basketball, and all the girls talked about him, flirted with him, daydreamed about him, you know, like whatever went into it, that's what happened with Zach, okay? So I found myself in middle school wanting to be like Zach because he was friends with my best friend, right? All the girls wanted to talk, hang out with him, all this kind of stuff. And so I found myself buying clothes that kind of looked like Zach's clothes. I found myself buying shoes that, you know, something that Zach would probably wear. In fact, Zach was a big basketball player, so there's one time where I'm like, you know what, I'm going to play basketball, like Zach plays basketball. And so I step out onto the court, I'm like, I want to play, guys. And they're like, okay. And it would have gone really well as long as I never touched the ball. And if someone would have taught me how to shoot a basketball, that would have been helpful too, probably in that moment. Because it was like a shot put just going up at the goal, and that doesn't work so well, you know? That was probably the moment when I realized, man, I am not Zach. Like, I'm not wired that way. I'm not designed that way. I can't fit into that mold of him. And I started to ask the question, well, then who am I? Who am I? And looking back, I realized that some of the copying and imitating that I was doing had more to do with my own insecurities, right, than it ever had to do with Zach, and my own fears than it ever had to do with him. And because my friendships were changing, and I just felt lost. And at that time, I wouldn't say this, I couldn't articulate this as a middle school student, but I was really asking the question, who am I? Where do I belong? And why am I here? What's the purpose behind my life? Now, like me, as a middle school student, you may not use those actual words of who am I, but you may have wondered and thought about the same thing. Because what we're really asking in that moment is a question of identity. Like, what makes me me? Like, what makes me tick? How am I wired? How am I fit to be in this world? And if you're like me, you can sometimes like struggle to try to answer that question, because oftentimes we answer it by what we do, not actually who we are. And the tricky thing about identity is most of the time we're getting our answer to this question based off of everyone else around us. And here's what I mean by this. Okay, so I've got 3 jars that are set up here. And this will be, we'll call these like identity jars, or how I feel about myself jars. And on the first jar, sometimes we find our identity in people's expectations of us. And there's a certain expectation that they have for what we do or how we act in this world. Maybe it's a parent's expectation for you. Maybe it's a coach's expectation for how you play in a game. It could be like a teacher's expectation for how you do a group project. And what happens is we can find ourselves trying to meet that expectation. So like take grades, for example. There's a certain line at which you feel like it is enough, which is what the green tape kind of represents. And so when I get to enough, and it doesn't have to be like for grades, some of you are like, it's enough to get a C because that was hard, like super hard. So this is enough. And my parents will buy me a cake if I get a C in my math class. Like, I totally get that, right? Okay? But there's this measure that is placed on you of an expectation that this is enough. And this is what I need to strive for. And sometimes we can find our identity in being just enough to please the people around us. And if we, like, all of a sudden you're like, hey, you know what I pulled out? I pulled out a B in math. They're like, let's go for ice cream, all right? Because all of a sudden you've exceeded their expectation. But regardless, we're still measuring ourselves based on what other people think of us. And oftentimes we're finding our identity in that. Another way that I think we measure ourselves, and this is what the second jar will represent, is we measure ourselves by judgments that whether we make against ourselves or other people make against us. And so here's what I mean by this. There are often times when we're measuring ourselves, especially if you have social media or anything along those lines, where you're like, okay, I'm here, and apparently the rest of the world is up there. And so I'm just not enough. I'm not tall enough, I'm not smart enough, I'm not good looking enough, I'm not talented enough, I'm not strong enough, I'm not enough of an athlete. I mean, it could go on and on and on and on. My family's not enough. And we just feel like we haven't really measured up. And whether that's because we're judging ourselves based on what we're seeing as we're scrolling through reels and all this kind of stuff, or based on just what other people are projecting onto us. And so all of a sudden we find our identity and our value in something that's just not enough. And that has some real consequences in your life, right? You guys understand this? Like, this is the reason, or one of the reasons, I won't say it that strongly, this is one of the reasons why I think many high school students deal with value, self-worth, depression, is because they feel like, I'm just not enough. And as they look at the people around them, they feel like they're just not measuring up. So we can find our identity in people's expectations. We can find our identity in basically just not measuring up, like I'm not enough people's judgments or being judged by others. But then we can also find our identity, and this is a third way, by our appearance, by how we want to project ourselves to other people. So like take, for example, let's just say you're a star athlete, okay? And you had a fantastic game, all right? Let's say you, played for, who's a really good football? Fairgrove. Let's say you played for Fairgrove. I'm not going to say Willard. I thought about saying Ozark, and I thought that's too close to home, all right? So, all right. All right. So, I love you, Derek. I'm sorry, man. I love you, man. All right. We'll be friends after this. I promise. We'll be friends after this, Derek. It'll be okay. All right. But let's say like you're a star athlete, and you expect your performance always to be like right here, whatever that is. However many touchdowns, however many passes complete, whatever it is. You expect to operate at this level. It doesn't take long when you start achieving this for everyone else to expect it from you, right? You see this when you how many of you guys watch NFL football? And like you got your favorite player and you know they're not playing well, right? Like this is your expectation and they're down here and you're like, dude, I'm taking you out of my fantasy football league because you ain't performing, all right? That's not happening. So there are times, listen up, there are times when we base our identity off of what we want people to think about us. So this can happen with physical appearance, like I want to look a certain way, I want to dress a certain way. This can also happen from performance-based things, like those of you that play music. I want to be first chair, or I want the solo, or choir. I want to be the person that's out front. You guys see what I'm saying? And we can base our identity off of how we want to appear to others. Now, there's some problems with this. There's some problems with basically measuring ourselves and then basing our identity off of those measurements. Because we can believe that if we meet all the lines in life, the ways that we measure ourselves, that we'll be liked and accepted and loved. That's the heart behind measuring ourselves with other people. And we think if I'm funny enough, if I'm smart enough, if I'm skinny enough, trendy enough, fast enough, pretty enough, strong enough, winning enough, successful enough, and even like Christian enough, I'll be good, right? But man, there's some major problems with finding your identity and measuring yourself from other people. The first challenge is this. You're comparing yourself to other people, right? And almost always, there will be someone who's better than you or smarter than you or that you feel is prettier than you. And so you just kind of have this line that you feel like you never really meet. And so it leaves you lacking. It leaves you wanting. And so then you start searching for those things just in other areas of your life. And we just feel like we never measure up. The second challenge with our thinking in this is we compare ourselves to ourselves, specifically when it comes to appearance. Like the star athlete. You know, if you have a really good game, then maybe you're like, okay, now I need to be up here. Now what just happened? I'm not enough anymore. Or take a star athlete, gets into a car accident, breaks their leg. Now I can't do this anymore. I can't even measure myself this way anymore. So what happens? Well, I don't know how I feel about myself because I can't do what gave me value in this world and where I was finding it. You guys see this problem? You see what I'm talking about? When you measure yourself against other people, you will not be enough. And at some point in time, you're going to hit a low because you're comparing yourself to everyone else. And so here's what I want to do. I want to change the question. Instead of asking the question, who am I? Here's the question that I actually want you to ask. Because when you ask the question, who am I? You're asking it to yourself. So you're trying to find your identity in who you are. And you're trying to find it from other people and maybe what you think of yourself. But this is a better question to ask. God, who am I to you? Who am I to you? Who do you say that I am? Who did you create me to be? And you may not realize this, but God actually tells you. But it takes you reading and listening to what he says and believing it for it to truly take effect in your life. So here's what I want to do. I'm going to give you a chance to hear what God says about you. This is Ephesians chapter 1. And Paul is writing this. He's one of the great missionaries of the early church. He is writing this to a bunch of young Christians that are in a town called Ephesus. Ephesus was a major trade town. There was probably about 250,000 people there. The trade route would go right through Ephesus, so there's a lot of worldly things happening in this town. And there were a lot of things that people probably found their identity in that were not Christ. And Paul is saying, listen, you guys need to find out who you are in Jesus. So here's what he writes to them. This is Ephesians chapter 1, verses 4 and 5. It says this, even before he made the world, God loved us and chose us in Christ to be holy and without fault in his eyes. God decided in advance to adopt us into his own family by bringing us to himself through Jesus Christ. This is what he wanted to do, and it gave him great pleasure. Here's my main point, guys. I'm just going to give it to you right now. Before God made the world, he chose you and adopted you because he loves you. That's it. Before he made the world, he chose you and adopted you because he loves you. And so you don't have to measure yourself by other people. You just have to understand what that means when God says it to you as a believer in Jesus. So I'm going to give you 3 stories to kind of help you understand what it means. I'm going to talk about kickball, We're going to talk about a kid named Deshaun, and we're going to talk about Trajan. All right, Trajan. So first, kickball. How many of you like to play kickball? All right. How many of you hate kickball? All right. A few of you. Do you like any sports? Are there any sports that you like? No, Alyssa, no. It didn't matter what you would say, Kevin. I hate it pretty much. All right. Yeah, so I liked kickball as a kid. I thought it was a really fun game. I'm not the most athletic person, right? Like, you guys realize that? Looking at me, you're like, yep, I can see that, Kevin, all right? And in 5th grade, there were times in PE where we would play kickball. We'd all run out to the field. We'd get there, and before we'd start the game, we'd have to do something very important. Do you guys know what it is? Pick teams. That's right. It's one of the most insecure, fearful things that you can do for a 5th grader in the world is have other students pick teams. And so here's how it would work in my 5th grade class. Zach was the best. Different Zach, by the way, which is ironic in this sermon, but different Zach in 5th grade. And then there was Steven, and they would stand on either side, and they would start picking teams. Now, what do you think they would look for the first few people that they would pick? Just shout some things at me. What would you look for? They're friends. Okay, so it's like, hey, Billy, over here. Hey, Sally, because we know each other. I don't want you to feel bad, that kind of stuff. I just have to say, I'm impressed that you would say friends, because I would not choose that. I would literally choose something different if I was picking my kickball team. What would you pick? What else would you pick? What? Talent. Okay, so most athletic, talented. I'm looking for people like soccer players that can boot the ball, you know what I'm talking about, wherever they want. I'm looking for people who are athletic, people who can field, people who can throw the ball and nail somebody as they're running around the bases. That's what I'm looking for. So that's what Zach and Steven would do. They would pick people that they thought were good, right? Good at kickball. And then you get down to the very end. And there's those 3 kids, maybe 4. And they're having a hard time choosing, not because they're good, but because they're the worst of the worst. You know what I mean? You got one kid with snot running down his nose, and you're just I don't know what dude, I don't know how to deal with this and choose that. And so you start debating the worst of the worst. So when you get down to the bottom, they're chosen right in the end, but they're not really wanted. And I think sometimes we can feel like that with God, where he's playing some game of cosmic kickball, he's picking people, and he gets down to the bottom, and sure, we're chosen by God, I understand that, but I don't feel like I'm really wanted by him. I'm sure God would want someone else rather than me. Well, remember what Paul wrote in verses 5 and 6? He said, he chose you before the creation of the world, and at the end of that verse it says, and it gave him great pleasure. That means you're not the end of the line, guys. For those of you who believe in Jesus, God says, you are valuable to me. In fact, you are so valuable that before I even created the world, I had you in mind. I had you in mind. That means he wants you. God chose you before you ever even did anything, before you ever even could measure anything. God chose you. Second story, Deshaun. There was a student several years ago in our ministry. His name was Deshaun, and he was in our ministry for about a year. And Deshaun was a kid that just had a really hard life. There were things that happened to him that were tough. When he was a baby, he was actually put up for adoption because his mom really didn't want and couldn't handle a child at that time. And so she put him up for adoption. A family decided to actually adopt Deshaun. And at first, he felt like it was his family. This is family, I love this is mom, this is dad, even though they're adopted mom and adopted dad. But around 5 or 6 years old, that's when the abuse started to happen from his adopted father. And it continued to happen. And occasionally his mother would step in, but until he was about 14 or 15, this was a regular occurrence in Deshaun's house. And eventually and courageously, he finally told someone what was going on. And the state stepped in, he was removed from this home. In fact, Deshaun would tell you it was one of the best things that he ever did. He went into foster care to get out of that situation. And so he would move from family to family in the foster care system until he finally landed with a family that was actually a part of our church, part of Northside. And so they brought him to church. That's how he got involved in our youth ministry. And this family included him. They bought him Christmas presents. They invited him over, included him to be part of the family, like all this kind of stuff. But there was something in him that felt like he never really belonged. And I think it had to do with the fact that he was hurt so much in life that he was unwilling to open himself up to someone else truly loving him and being a part of that family. And so after a series of bad decisions for Deshaun, he decided to leave that family. And here's what Deshaun felt. He was chosen, but he was never really included. He never really belonged. And we can think about God in the same way. I'm chosen. God wants me. But do I really belong to him and to his people? I mean, I go to church services, I pray, sometimes I read the Bible, but I know what he's all about, but do I really belong to him? Guys, God chose you and adopted you. I don't know if you know this, but adoption is like a permanent thing. It's not like hey, I just want you for a little bit. It's not like a puppy that you bring into your home and you're like, oh, no, you're peeing on the carpet too much. And then like you send them away to somebody else's family. Like, it doesn't happen like that, right? Adoption is like a permanent thing. And so when God says you're adopted, he says you're adopted as sons and daughters through Jesus. So here's what that means. When you believed in Jesus and were baptized into his name, you became a part of God's family permanently, right? Like you are a son, you are a daughter of God. That means you're included into his family. He is your heavenly Father that you can rely on in tough or any situation, and he treats you as a son or a daughter. The last story I want to share with you is about Trajan. This is a little history lesson. Who likes history? Who likes history? Yeah, I love you people. I want you to know that. You're my favorites, all right? Yeah. So Trajan was born sometime around 50 AD. So this would be just after the time that Jesus died, was buried, and rose from the dead. And so Trajan was born a Roman senator in modern-day, basically, Spain. As a teenager and young adult, he served in the Roman army, and he served under Emperor Domitian. Now, Trajan was very well liked by a bunch of people in the army. He had like a whole little fanboy club, right, that went around him and all this kind of stuff. And so people really liked him. Well, Domitian died, the emperor died, and a new emperor came to power, Emperor Nerva, and he was not as well liked by the army. And so here's what Emperor Nerva did. He decided to adopt Trajan because it would solidify his power, it would help his reputation, and it would make him a stronger ruler as an emperor. So here's the deal. Trajan was chosen. Trajan was adopted, but he wasn't really loved. And we can think that God chooses us, that God adopts us, but does he really, really love us? And the answer is yes. That's why he did those things. In fact, it says in love that he chose to do these things in Ephesians. He chose you, he adopted you through Jesus because he loves you. You cannot exaggerate God's love for you. Like, think about this. You can't exaggerate. Well, God's love is big. Nope, it's bigger. Nope, it's massive. Nope, it's huge. No, it's like as big as here to the moon and back. Nope, it's bigger than that. You can't exaggerate the love that God has for you. And here's the amazing part of it. There's no strings attached to it, right? You don't have to measure up to God's love, right? You just have to accept it and say, I want this in my life, and I need to believe it. So if we go back to our glasses over here, remember that we had expectations, and we had judgment, and then we had our appearance, and we try to measure ourselves. Well, when we stop measuring ourselves against other people and start hearing what God has to say for us, all of a sudden we take these little enough measurements off of our glasses. We don't need them anymore because we're done. We're not looking at people anymore. We're just listening to what God says about us. And all of a sudden he says, you are loved and you are absolutely included into my kingdom. You're a part of my family. You're adopted. You don't have to want or desire this anymore because it's already happened for you. You don't have to look to other people to feel that way. You don't have to measure yourself or try to achieve a certain status or fill up to a certain point. Guys, it's been done. The question that we really come to today is, do you believe it? Are you willing to take off the markers that you measure yourself to other people and say, okay, God, I want the identity that you have for me in Jesus. I'm tired of living up to other people's expectations. I'm tired of not being enough. I'm tired of trying to fill up an appearance that just I feel like I can't measure up. And I'm telling you, God says that you are more than enough. When you find your identity in Jesus, you are more than enough in him. God chose you and adopted you because he loves you. I want to leave you with just this thought. Imagine what would happen if you really believed this. Like some of you are dealing with insecurities in your life right now because you don't believe this. Like you're looking at things, whether it's online or you're walking the halls of school and you're measuring yourself to someone else, and that's where you're finding your identity. And you wonder, why am I dealing with so many issues in life? It's because you're not listening to what God says about you. You're not understanding how much you are loved and included and accepted by God. Because when you embrace that, then I have no desire to really please anybody else or measure up to anybody else's standard. What if you walked into school believing what God says about you, so you don't have to prove yourself or hide yourself? Imagine what you may feel instead. When you find your identity in Jesus, you are enough. Maybe for some of you today, you walked into this room and you've been measuring yourselves against other people, and you never knew that this is how God felt about you. But I have to tell you, to believe this and accept this, it comes through believing in Jesus. And so some of you today need to believe in Jesus and be baptized in his name, to understand and to truly believe what God says about you. And if that's you, I want to talk to you about that and help you take that step. For others of you today, you need to be reminded of what God has done for you through Jesus. And so we're going to take communion as part of this next worship service time, where there's communion on either side of the stage, and we can remember that God gave us this new identity through Jesus, who died on the cross for us. There's a bread cup that's underneath the juice because, single serve, COVID type stuff. But you can take the bread cup and remember that Jesus gave his body for you on the cross, and you can take the juice and remember he gave his blood for you on the cross. You can also give an offering during this time to help other people find their identity in God. But here's what I want to encourage you with. You just need to listen and respond to God. Some of you, like I said, have been measuring yourselves way too much. And you're missing the voice of God in your life saying, you are enough because you're loved and you're chosen and you're adopted into my family.